Good morning. My name is Breytenbach, and I'm from the IPP office in South Africa. Our panel is going to discuss from our experience, why is private sector participation in infrastructure not happening as much as we believe it can happen in Africa? We had two ideas. One is social infrastructure, and then obviously on the other hand you have got economic infrastructure. I'm going to hand over to the panel because they will discuss most of the points, but I think what we did discuss was that you need stability in your country. You need to make the private sector feel comfortable. However, when I started becoming involved in infrastructure in South Africa, Richard Tinsley was then a trainer in the tell you all of the examples of how we learn what it means if the government is not taking the right decisions. So I would like to hand over to the team. I'm going to give Samir Gray-Johnson, Head of Infrastructure Strategic Business Unit and Partnership and Resource Mobilization Division of NEPAD. Samir will speak about the more umbrella type of things and set the scene for the discussion. Over to you, Samir. It is now 9:08, and I'm going to open the floor for questions. Sorry. Oh, 11. Yeah, sorry, it's my computer, I forgot. Yeah, 11, 11. Yeah, should use my arm watch. I think we have got time until past, so I'm going to open the floor for questions, and please be specific. Tell us who you are, from where you are, and then ask the question, and then tell us if you want to direct it to somebody specific. Otherwise, we'll take the principal who's best placed to answer it. That person will answer it. So I'm going to open the floor to you. Thank you. At the back is a question. So maybe we'll take three questions, and then we will answer and continue like that. Thank you.
Thank you for your good explanation. Do you hear me through the mic? Okay. My name is Bernard van Meteren. I work for FMO, the Netherlands Development Bank. And to your stories, I'd like to add a view from the current view as we see it from lenders, because there's so much money around for IPPs in the energy sector in Africa, and there are so many projects around, and that has bred a lot of success with the IPP program in South Africa, with the Get Fit program in Uganda, both very successful. But the reason they were successful is because they provided for developers and lenders a certain broadness of things that were within the package. A government guarantee, there was a history of good payments, there was a bank LC for the off-taker, there were offshore accounts, there was an assurance on currency convertibility, and a number of other things. What we see at the moment is that the government had seen, especially in the solar area, that prices got down quite a lot. Think about the 3.8 euro cents per kilowatt hour in Senegal, in a project that had everything, MEGA insurance, PRG, everything you can think of. Now what we are seeing at the moment is that countries say, okay, we like this low price, but at the same time we are trying to get rid of pieces from the package. discussions of whether they will support currency compatibility. And yes, that will lead to failure of projects. They will not be closed. We see in about 6 countries arrears with payments. We see a discussion on offshore accounts. So we see at the same time a pressure on the projects in terms of the tariff, which is a great thing for Africa, that it gets so cheap. But at the same time, we see that a number of pretty essential areas in the risk spread are taken away, or are taken away in negotiations. And that, in our view, and that's what we're seeing in quite a lot of projects where we're involved in negotiations, is making sure that it is unsure whether those projects will close. So that is the lender's view. I would like to add this, and maybe you'd like to react on that. But we think it is very good for the market that the project gets low, but at the same time, all the risk elements and cover elements that are being taken away, or in negotiations requested to be taken away, is also putting a halt to this success. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think there was a question here in front.
Hi, this is Lyda Fitz from U.S. Trade and Development Agency. I thought it was interesting the earlier results of the survey that identified from both the project developer side and the investor side that the number one risk was identified as political risk or change of government policies. And I'm curious, particularly to Maduna's point about policy risk being something that the government had to take on, of how governments can best manage that. What can governments do? Are they doing, or should they be doing it to bring down that element?
Thank you, Lyda. Was there another question? Oh, yeah, there at the back.
Thank you. DC Moore from Consolidated Infrastructure Group Limited, based out of South Africa. Just want to talk a bit about, or get your thoughts a bit on, sort of, especially in South Africa, around the IPP program. I think with power projects and how hard it is to get them done across the continent, or any infrastructure project, we focus a lot on the closure, but not a lot of folks, developers, lenders, institutions, focus on what comes after closure and you're running an actual project. So when you think about some of the commitments in South Africa around local employment, some of the commitments in South Africa around local community involvement. Now, for instance, we have an O&M company that is locally started, BE level 2, and we've seen a lot of internationals prefer to import Europeans or Chinese to actually do the work on the projects. But if you want to have a successful PPP program, it definitely takes a balance of getting the community relations part right, local employment part right, or you don't have the political cover you need to proceed. So I'd like to hear from you guys or anybody on how the local participation post-commissioning shapes your view and your program.
Okay. Thank you very much. So maybe the first question on the lenders, Omar, I'll give it to you if you have got any comments. I think it was well put. So I think if you have got any further comments, it would be good. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good point, and I think it takes, what we're the question is, why are governments doing that? And where is that advice coming from? It's everybody knows, and the government knows, that they need this infrastructure put in place fast. It affects a whole lot of their own, own constituencies, and there's a number of ripple effects. So I think the question we need to ask ourselves is, why do they push back on key risk areas that everybody who has structured projects understand needs to be covered? And and I do see around the continent there's a lot of bad advice, and You know, and I think sometimes people feel they push back on the lenders and they think the lenders will eventually succumb. But, you know, the credit committees, you know, within the banks, yeah, maybe that, you know, that is not understood as well by the governments, because it's not going to change. There's requirements to be met, there's risk to be allocated, there's things that have to be met. And maybe it's an education, but yeah, we see it all over where people push back on key risk elements, which is unfortunate.
Thank you, Omar. Samir, I'm going to ask you to answer Laida's political change and policy question, because I want to give Maduna the opportunity to speak about the community involvement and just explain a little bit about our program. I think just as one point from me, in South Africa, we will never get the lowest of the lowest prices. And why? Because we have decided as a country to put socioeconomic development as part of the price that you are going to bid if you invest in our program. But I'll leave it to Maduna, then he can explain how our program is structured, how the commitments work, our monitoring process, and then also local participation. So I'm going to give to Samir first, and then just after Samir, Maduna, if you can follow up. If you want to say something about the political change and changing policy, just do it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karen. I think last year at the World Bank Infrastructure Governance Forum, it came out very strongly that leadership matters, that most of the projects that we're doing well across board in Africa were projects that there was a strong policy component of it. There was predictability, that the ministries involved were, at least the sector ministries, were very clear on how to roll out these projects, and there were necessary guarantees, and the leadership was very clear and predictable. Interesting enough, last year also, the scholar Amadou Sy, the Senegalese scholar from the Brookings Institute, computed some numbers and came up with a figure that 72% of infrastructure that is being provisioned in Africa is actually being funded through public funds. So that kind of changed the game when we went to the Emergence Conference in Abidjan. We found out that, in fact, Africa's governments are still funding the transformation. It's actually it's African governments that are signing up to these loans or zero interest loans, or however we want to compute the loans, and that the new players like China, Turkey, Malaysia, and so forth, the loans that they're given are being, of course, being signed up to by our own governments. So the question remains, if our own governments are aware that the issue of policy and the issue of political risk is really important, not to mention the fact that they are funding most of the infrastructure, we would assume that they should be much more predictable in some of the policy choices that we are making. But I think what we've come to realize, that I think Africa is becoming much more clearer. Most African countries are being...
I'll just say a few words about the question that was raised by Laida. I think policy, we're not saying policy shouldn't be changed. You can change policy, but you need to understand the impact of that change on the project. And then once you have quantified the impact of the change, and then you need to say, then how do I keep the project neutral from this impact? For instance, in the South African context, we had a change in grid codes, for instance, which means the operation environment changes, and then the project will have to incur probably, for instance, additional costs to comply with the new requirements, and then we need to understand how much is that cost, and then once we understand the cost, then we need to then adjust the prices accordingly so that you can recover that cost. Remember, the project are becoming more and more competitive, which means your IRR is very low, and so now you wouldn't expect the project to continue incurring additional cost, yet they didn't project to have such cost when they were bidding. So we try to adjust that because the price is fixed for the duration of the contract. It will only increase by CPI, for instance, on the renewable side. So now any changes or any deviation on cost, which is not attributed to the investor, needs to be looked at if it's related to policy, for instance. And then we will have to negotiate on how we cater for that cost associated with that change. And coming back to the local communities and the involvement of local communities and the employment thereafter, and adhering to the commitment made by the project. We have a whole team at the office that monitors these things. But what I'm saying is that the team looks at the contract from the beginning to the end in terms of the commitment made at each and every different sphere. When it comes to jobs, for instance, they report on a quarterly basis on the jobs created, and then we also do spot audit on some of the contracts. Obviously, I'm not saying everything is above board. There could be cases that we do find those we find that they didn't comply with the contract. We impose penalties for that, and then they need to pay those penalties if they did not comply. But just to look at the structure of the project, how it's structured. The current requirement, we will change this probably on the next round. The project needs to be 40% South African owned. That's the first requirement. Secondly, out of the 40%, you must have Black participation. You must also have community ownership. The community should own at least 22.5% of the project. And in addition to the 2.5% ownership, you need to have what we call socio-economic development contribution, which is about 1.5%. You beat that as well. The minimum will be 1.5% of the revenue, which should go to the communities. The last one is enterprise development, which you need to also bid that, which will also go to the communities. So there's a lot of money in total from what we have calculated is that about 19 billion rand of the project that we have signed, out of the revenue that will flow from the project that we have signed will go to those communities where the projects are located, which is a lot of money. And we said we need to look at that properly and make sure that we structure it properly. The 19 billion rand is only SED, which means socio-economic development money that goes to the community. From a shareholding point of view, it's about 23 billion rand that will go to those communities. So that's a lot of money that will go in there. Our view is that we need to manage it properly, and we need to engage with all the projects and understand which areas they are investing. Remember, we started 7 years ago. It's 8 years now. So it's only 8 years since we started the program, and we are learning as we go along. But the project became operational around 2013, towards the end of 2013, mostly from 2014 going onward. So we started managing the inflows of money and the inflows of things related to the project, and keep on improving from time to time in terms of what are the issues at the ground level, because there are a number of issues that keeps on coming to the fore, which we need our attention and needs us to manage them properly. So, but to cut matters short, I think there are a lot of issues that we engage with the project at the ground level, and there are a lot of issues that requires more attention. As we increase the number of projects, we need to also increase our monitoring capability as well, because you can't have the same staff monitoring projects that are increasing almost every year. This year we added about 27 projects that needs to be monitored as well. So it's a huge task that requires a lot of capacity. I'm not too sure whether at this point I can say we are up to the task, but I think we are doing our best, and we have engagement internally as well to say how do we capacitate the office so that we can monitor this project more successfully.
Thank you, Maduna. I'm not going to wrap up because I think a lot has been said. But I would like just to say country stability and governance, transparency, certainty, trust between the public and private sector, an enabling environment to make sure people feel safe to get their returns. Then things like credit enhancement was mentioned, which I still believe we need to look at, risk allocation, hard currency risks, And then innovation. I think structuring your project is incredibly important, and making sure that you deal with risks in a proper way. I would like to ask you to give a hand of applause to the team. I think they were great, and thank you very much.
I'm sure everyone is frustrated because there's so much talent and experience here. But let me encourage people to continue the conversation at lunch. We're not going to have a networking break. We're going to dive into the next panel. But please join me in thanking this incredible panel for putting forward a lot of the dynamic responses that are needed in this moment of emergency and cowardly capital. Okay, so onward.
Doing business in Africa. You can't afford to be without Africa Investor.